militaristic culture, and the Japanese kind of adopted that because they were sick of being kicked around by the Europeans, and pretty successfully, because they defeated the Russians, in the early stages of World War of the 20th century. It was quite a shock to everyone in Europe, and cause for great celebration in Japan, and no wonder. But anyways, they militarized the hell out of their young men and taught them basically that the Japanese were a master race, and that other people were subhuman. It's a very common human way of thinking, by the way. I would say it's really the default way that human tribes think about other tribes. It's a little more complicated than that because human tribes tend to trade with other tribes. So it's not all demonization, but a lot of it is, and if you look around the world in the anthropological literature, what you see is that the names that most tribes have for themselves is something like the human beings or the people, indicating that the rest of the people aren't really people. God only, they're barbarians, or, they live out where the sun is being eaten by the dragon of the night or something like that. And, the word barbarian is a word that comes from the Greeks making fun of how non-Greeks spoke. They thought they went bar, 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 something like that. So, anyways, what Goodall found was that the chimps, like the chimp adolescents in particular the males, would patrol the borders of their territory in groups of 3 or 4, and often with a female or 2, but the females didn't seem to be really they were more part of the group rather than the initiators. But what the chimps would do is if they found a chimp from another troop, even if that was a chimp that had moved from their troop in the not too distant past and joined another, because sometimes the males leave and sometimes they go to other troops, if they outnumbered them, they would tear them to pieces. And it looked like that's why they were doing the border patrol. They're out looking for trouble. They're gangs, roughly speaking. They're looking for trouble. But the point of it is that, and they would only attack if they outnumbered. Because chimps can, I wouldn't say they count, but they have a rudimentary notion of group size, I don't think you can count without being able to verbalize, but you can estimate at a glance. And so, when I say tear apart, that's exactly what I mean. There's no upper limit on the brutality. And so Goodall discovered that first. And she didn't tell anybody about it. Now, she had her reasons. Some of them I think were ideological. Oh, the lovely chimps, and fair enough. But some of it was also, she thought that maybe the chimps had been corrupted as a consequence of their contact with human beings and that their natural behavior had been somehow transformed. And that's not, it's reasonable to be cautious if you're a scientist before you go out and say, hey, chimps go to war. Isn't that revolutionary? Because it is, right? Because it just ends the idea that our warlike and malevolent nature is a function of culture. Like if chimps do it, well, what are they, perverted by their own culture? I don't think so. There are more and less violent chimp cultures and there are more and less violent baboon cultures. So there's some cultural variation. But since Goodall's time, this sort of behavior is being documented on many, many chimp troops. So that's us in a nutshell. And it's not self-evident that if you put the typical adolescent male, say, who's not a very well-formulated personality, and because he's not that individual, and he hasn't seen much of the world, and the typical guy that goes into the army is, he's kind of on the margins of society, maybe he's not particularly bright, and I'm not trying to be insulting by that, but it's not exactly a high-end job. You put someone like that in a place where there's no rules. It's like, who leads where there are no rules? Well, the probability that it's the friendliest and nicest people is very, very low. And so what seemed to happen in Nanking was the Japanese soldiers took their cues from the people with the most brutal imaginations. So, and people can have pretty brutal imaginations, especially when they start to compete. So I was interested in that, what exactly was at the core of that malevolence. And I think it is uniquely human. The chimps will go tear another chimp apart, but basically they're going to kill them. That's their goal, and maybe it takes a while, but it's not going to take 4 weeks. Whereas if you're a human being, you can draw out your enemy's death for a very, very long period of time. And part of that is the desire to produce the misery and suffering that's attendant on the death. And only human beings have the imagination to do that. That's why I think, and we'll return to this, that's why I think that in the book of Genesis, when people's eyes are open and they become self-conscious, they always also learn the difference between good and evil. Once your eyes are open and you know what you're like, once you know you're naked and vulnerable, then you can exploit that in other people. And only human beings have that kind of knowledge. So the fact that we know that we can be hurt makes us particularly dangerous. Because if I know how I can be hurt, I sure know how you can be hurt. So, you know, it's a nasty situation. And then, of course, I'm kind of interested in the motivation for that. So, you know, you look at the Columbine kids, for example, and, you know, the mayhem they produced was trivial compared to the mayhem they were planning. You know, if it was up to those two guys, they would have bombed Detroit flat. That, you know, they had visions of doing exactly that. And it was a media spectacular, and they didn't do it because they were, you know, poor kids in some sense who were bullied. That is an idiotic explanation. It's not true. You know, everybody's a bloody outsider, you know. I mean, I'm sure there isn't a single one of you that don't have a memory from junior high where you were an outcast in one way or another. Maybe some of you weren't, but it's very, very common. And to think of that as sufficient motivation to, you know, shoot people cold-bloodedly in a high school, it's like, sorry, that's a little on the naive side. So I'm very, very interested in what makes up that motivation. You know, because malevolence plus nuclear weapons is not a good combination. And so it doesn't really look to me like we can afford that kind of unconscious malevolence anymore because we're just too damn powerful. And if the wrong person ends up being like that with the wrong weapons, it's like the game's over. So I've also become convinced while I've been looking through this that the problem that we're discussing is not a sociological problem or a political problem or an economic problem. Because, you know, a lot of what you'll read, and a lot of political scientists will tell you this sort of thing because they're basically almost always closet Marxists. They'll tell you that the reason for struggle, for competition between nations is economic. And I think that's absurd. Not because it isn't true, but because it doesn't actually address a more fundamental issue, which is, okay, well, economic struggle is a struggle about who has access to what's valued. But there's nothing self-evident about what's valued. That's the problem. It's like, you know, you have the idea of natural resource. It's like, yeah, oil's not a natural resource till you have an automobile. You know, I mean, the interplay between cultural value structures and what constitutes a natural resource is so tightly put together, except for maybe air and water, that saying, well, there are natural resources, which means things of intrinsic value, and that's what people fight over. Well, you've made the mystery disappear inside the word natural resource, but you haven't solved anything. So the question is, well, why would people fight over things that they value? Well, because there's all sorts of things you could value, like peace, for example. So it's not a sufficient explanation. And it's also not clear to me that people's primary motivations are economic. You know, it's one element of motivation. It's not trivial, but I would say the motivation isn't even really economic. It's more related to dominance hierarchy position. And that's fundamentally a sexual motivation, especially for men. Because if men are higher up in the male dominance hierarchy, then women are much more attracted to them. So you could say, well, that's economics. I don't think it is. Sorry, it's economics is just a secondary consequence of that. And I don't believe, by the way, that that's a theory, because there's excellent documentation on hyperaggression in adolescent males. And the best evidence suggests that adolescent males become hyperaggressive when you put them in situations where they can't win. And then they become hyperaggressive in an attempt to formulate a dominance hierarchy so that some of them can rise to the top and basically be attractive. So you can call that economic if you want, but I think you're pushing your luck with that sort of explanation.